It was a chilly evening in Chicago, and the city buzzed with its usual energy. The streets were alive with people heading home after work, kids playing on sidewalks, and the distant hum of traffic. In the middle of all this, a man in his late 50s sat behind the wheel of his car, driving through a neighborhood he had visited countless times before. He wasn't just any man. He was someone who had spent decades fighting for fairness and equality in a system that often favored the powerful over the powerless. A judge by profession, he had seen it all: corruption, injustice, and the raw pain of those who felt crushed under the weight of bias. That night, he had attended a charity event where he spoke passionately about creating opportunities for marginalized communities. His speech earned him a standing ovation, but as he left the venue, little did he know that his own life was about to become part of the story he so often told. The drive home took him through a quieter part of town, a place known more for its struggles than its successes. It wasn't a route he usually took, but something about the calmness of the streets drew him in. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was curiosity. Whatever the reason, he decided to take the scenic way back. But just as he turned onto a dimly lit street, the peace shattered. Suddenly, two police cars appeared out of nowhere, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness like knives. One pulled up behind him, another blocked the road ahead, and within seconds, 4 officers jumped out, guns drawn. Their voices boomed through the cold air, shouting commands that barely made sense. "Step out of the vehicle, hands where we can see them." The man froze for a moment, his mind racing. What was happening? Why were they stopping him? He hadn't broken any laws, he was sure of it. Slowly he raised his hands, trying to stay calm despite the rising panic in his chest. When one officer yanked open the car door, he didn't resist. Instead, he stepped out carefully, making sure his movements were slow and deliberate. But calmness didn't matter here. Before he could even say a word, he was shoved hard against the hood of his car. The metal was icy against his skin, and the sharp sting of handcuffs locking around his wrists sent a jolt through his body. None of the officers asked for his name or checked his ID. They didn't care why he was there or what he was doing. All they saw was a black man driving a nice car in a neighborhood they assumed he didn't belong in. One officer sneered at him, his tone dripping with disdain. "Fancy ride for someone like you," he said, glancing at the leather seats inside the car. Another chimed in, mocking him further. "Probably stolen, right? Guys like you always think you're too good for the rules." The man tried to explain himself, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I'm a judge," he said firmly, hoping those words would carry some weight. "You need to check my credentials, I haven't done anything wrong." But his words fell on deaf ears. If anything, they seemed to make the officers angrier. "Oh, yeah?" One of them shot back sarcastically. "A judge, sure buddy, and I'm the president." Laughter erupted among the group, and the man realized then that reasoning with them was pointless. This wasn't about facts or logic, it was about prejudice. They weren't seeing him as a person, they were seeing him as a stereotype, a target. They continued to bark orders and search his car. The man felt a mix of emotions: anger, fear, frustration, but above all, disbelief. How could this be happening? After everything he had done to fight for justice, how could he now find himself on the wrong side of it? What came next would test not only his patience but also his faith in humanity. Little did he know, this nightmare was far from over, and neither was his fight for dignity. The man stood there, his hands cuffed behind his back, as the officers rifled through his car with no regard for procedure or respect. Every drawer was yanked open, every pocket of his jacket turned inside out. It was clear they weren't looking for evidence. They were searching for something to justify their actions. And then they found it, a thick envelope tucked into the side pocket of his briefcase. Inside was cash, money he had withdrawn earlier, that day to pay for home repairs. To him it was just practicality, to them it was proof of guilt. One officer held up the envelope triumphantly, waving it in front of his face. "Look what we've got here," he said, smirking. "This is dirty money if I've ever seen it." The accusation hung heavy in the air, But the man knew better than to argue. These men weren't interested in explanations. They already had their story figured out. He was a criminal, plain and simple. But things took an even darker turn when one of the officers leaned closer, lowering his voice so only the man could hear. "Listen," he whispered harshly. "We can make this go away. All you need to do is cooperate." Cooperate? The word sent chills down his spine. What did they want from him? Before he could respond, another officer chimed in, louder this time. $10,000, he said bluntly. That's all it'll take to fix this misunderstanding. The audacity of the demand hit him like a punch to the gut. These men, sworn to protect and serve, were trying to extort him. Right there on the street, under the cover of flashing lights and shadows, they expected him to hand over 10 grand to buy his freedom. For a moment, the world seemed to spin. His mind raced with questions. Should he call their bluff? Should he refuse outright? Or should he play along until he found a way out? He didn't have much time to think. One of the officers grabbed him by the arm and shoved him toward the waiting police cruiser. "Get in," he barked. "We'll talk about your options at the station." At the precinct, the nightmare continued. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he sat alone in a small, cramped cell. The walls were cold and gray, the air stale and suffocating. For hours, no one spoke to him. No one offered water or asked if he needed anything. It was as though he had been forgotten, or worse, left intentionally to stew in uncertainty. When the officers finally returned, they weren't alone. A fifth man joined them, someone who looked older, more seasoned, maybe even higher ranking. His presence added a new layer of intimidation. "So," the older officer began, pulling up a chair and sitting directly across from him. "Let's cut to the chase. You've got two choices. Pay us and this whole thing disappears. Or don't and we'll make sure you regret it." The threat wasn't subtle. They explained how easy it would be to plant drugs in his car, fabricate witness statements, or pin some other crime on him. With their authority and connections, they could twist the truth however they wanted. No one would question them. Not in this town. The man listened silently, his jaw clenched tight. Part of him wanted to lash out, to scream at the top of his lungs that they couldn't get away with this. But deep down, he knew yelling wouldn't help. Instead, he focused on staying calm, calculating his next move. He thought about his phone, call rights, the one lifeline he still had, and decided to wait for the right moment to use it. As the hours dragged on, the officers grew restless. Their initial bravado started to crack, revealing cracks of desperation underneath. One of them paced back and forth, muttering under his breath. Another kept glancing nervously at the clock. It was clear they hadn't planned this far ahead. Extorting someone wasn't exactly textbook policing, and now they were stuck, unsure of what to do next. Finally, the older officer leaned forward again, his tone shifting slightly. "Look," he said, almost pleading now. "Just give us the money and we'll let you walk. No one has to know about this. You'll be free to go home, and we'll forget this ever happened." The irony wasn't lost on the man. Here he was, a figure who had spent years fighting for justice, being asked to compromise his principles to save himself. It was a test, one that would define not just his fate but also his character. He stared at the officers, letting the silence stretch between them. Then, without saying a word, he made a decision. Whatever happened next, he would face it head on. Because giving in to corruption wasn't an option. Not for him, not for anyone. Little did the officers know their scheme was about to unravel in ways they couldn't imagine. The man sat there in the cold, sterile cell, his mind working overtime. He knew he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. These officers had underestimated him. They thought they were dealing with just another person who would crumble under pressure. But they didn't know who they were messing with. This wasn't just someone who understood the law. This was someone who lived and breathed it. Every word they spoke, every threat they made, only fueled his resolve to expose them. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers returned, slamming the cell door open. "All right," he snapped, clearly irritated. We've given you enough time to think. What's it going to be? Are you paying up or not? The man looked up, his expression calm but unreadable. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the officer's face, the twitch in his jaw, the slight tremor in his voice. Even bullies got nervous when things didn't go exactly as planned. Finally, the man broke the silence. "You want money?" he asked, his tone measured but sharp. "Fine, but first I need to make a phone call." The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner before nodding reluctantly. Protocol required them to allow him that right, even if they hated it. They led him to a small desk in the corner of the precinct, where a landline phone sat untouched. He picked up the receiver and dialed a number from memory. On the other end, a familiar voice answered, a close friend and colleague who had worked alongside him for years. Without giving too much detail, he explained the situation carefully, using coded language to avoid alarming the officers listening in. "I'm in a bit of trouble," he said calmly. "Can you help me reach out to someone discreetly?" His friend caught on immediately. There was no hesitation, no questioning, just a firm promise to act fast. "Consider it done," came the reply. Hanging up the phone, the man turned back to the officers, his demeanor unchanged. They watched him closely, trying to gauge whether their scheme was still intact. For now, he played along, pretending to weigh his options. "Let me see the proof," he said finally. "Show me why I should pay." This threw them off balance. Proof? What proof? They hadn't anticipated needing actual evidence. They assumed intimidation alone would work. Now they scrambled to come up with something convincing. One officer muttered angrily under his breath while another pulled out a notebook, scribbling down fake details about a supposed robbery. It was laughable, really. To anyone else, it might have seemed convincing, but to someone who dealt with criminals daily, it was amateurish at best. As the night dragged on, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The officers grew more agitated, their confidence waning with each passing minute. They started arguing among themselves, whispering frantically about what to do next. Should they follow through with planting drugs in his car, or cut their losses and release him quietly? Neither option seemed safe anymore. Then, unexpectedly, the older officer stepped forward again. His tone was different this time, less threatening, almost apologetic. "Listen," he said, leaning closer. "Maybe we got this wrong. Maybe there's been some kind of misunderstanding." Misunderstanding? The audacity of the statement was staggering. Just hours ago, they were accusing him of being a criminal, extorting him for money and planning to frame him. Now they wanted to backtrack? The man didn't respond right away. He simply stared at them, letting the weight of their hypocrisy sink in. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that silenced the room. "Do you know who I am?" he asked softly, his eyes locking onto theirs. At first, they dismissed the question, rolling their eyes and exchanging smirks. Of course, they didn't care who he was. Until now, when he revealed his identity, his title, his position, his reputation, it hit them like a freight train. Their faces paled instantly. One of them stumbled backward, muttering, "Oh no." Another dropped the pen he'd been holding, his hands trembling visibly. The older officer, who had been so bold earlier, suddenly looked like a deer caught in headlights. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, chaos erupted. The same men who had mocked him, threatened him, and treated him like a criminal mere hours ago were now scrambling to undo everything. "Please," one of them begged, his voice cracking. "We didn't mean any harm. We were just following orders." Following orders? The excuse was as old as time itself, and yet here, it was again spilling from their lips in desperation. The man stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. He didn't say a word. Not yet. He let them sweat, let them feel the full weight of their actions. And then, in a voice that was both firm and steady, he delivered his final blow. "Your careers are over," he said simply, "and justice will be served." What happened next unfolded quickly. Within hours, internal affairs investigators arrived at the precinct, storming in with search warrants and questions. Evidence was collected, statements were taken, and the 4 officers were placed under immediate suspension. The man cooperated fully, recounting every detail of the ordeal with precision. His testimony painted a damning picture, one that left no room for doubt about their guilt. As news of the incident spread, public outrage reached a fever pitch. Protests erupted outside police headquarters demanding accountability and reform. Media outlets covered the story extensively, shining a spotlight on the systemic issues plaguing law enforcement. For many, this case became a symbol of everything wrong with the system, and also a beacon of hope that change was possible. But for the man at the center of it all, the fight was far from over. He knew exposing corruption was only the beginning. Real change required action, courage, and persistence. As he walked out of the precinct, free at last, he felt a mix of emotions: relief, anger, determination. This experience had shaken him deeply, but it had also strengthened his resolve. He vowed to use his platform to push for reforms, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Little did the officers know, their attempt to exploit him had backfired spectacularly. In targeting him, they had awakened a force far greater than themselves, a force driven by truth, integrity, and an unshakable belief in justice. The moment the officers realized who they were dealing with, panic set in like wildfire. Their bravado evaporated instantly, replaced by sheer terror. The same men who had mocked him, handcuffed him, and tried to extort money from him were now stumbling over themselves, desperate to undo the damage they'd caused. It was almost surreal, a complete reversal of power. One officer, the younger, one who had been so quick to sneer earlier, dropped to his knees right there in front of him. "Please," he begged, his voice trembling. "We didn't know it was you. We thought... He couldn't even finish his sentence. His face was pale, his hands shaking as if the weight of what they'd done was crushing him. Another officer tried to explain, stammering through a jumbled mess of excuses. "It wasn't personal. We weren't targeting you specifically, we just saw an opportunity." But their words fell flat. There was no justification for what they had done. No excuse could erase the humiliation, the fear, or the blatant abuse of power. To them, he had simply been another black man driving a nice car, someone they assumed wouldn't fight back. Now, faced with the reality of who he was, they were crumbling under the pressure of their own wrongdoing. The older officer, the one who had seemed so confident earlier, looked like a completely different person. Gone was the swagger, the authority in his tone. Instead, he stood there, sweating profusely, his eyes darting around as if searching for a way out. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we made a mistake. A huge mistake. Please give us a chance to make this right." For a while, a long moment, the man didn't respond. He let the silence stretch, savoring the irony of the situation. These men, who had treated him like a criminal just hours before, were now groveling at his feet. They wanted mercy, understanding, anything to save themselves. But he knew better than to offer false comfort. What they had done wasn't just about him. It was part of a much larger problem, and pretending otherwise would only perpetuate the cycle of injustice. Finally, he spoke. His voice was calm but firm, carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Do you have any idea how many people don't get this chance?" he asked, his gaze piercing. "How many innocent lives are destroyed because of actions like yours? People who don't have a title, who don't have connections, who don't have someone to call when things go wrong." His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. For the first time, the officers truly understood the gravity of their actions. They weren't just facing consequences for what they'd done to him. They were being held accountable for years of unchecked behavior, for every person they'd ever targeted unfairly. And now, thanks to their arrogance, they had walked straight into the one scenario they couldn't escape. As internal affairs investigators arrived on the scene, the officers' desperation reached new heights. They pleaded with anyone who would listen, offering explanations that contradicted each other. One claimed they were following orders from a superior, while another INSI. The courtroom was packed to the brim on the day of the trial, Reporters jostled for seats in the front row, their cameras clicking furiously as the 4 officers walked in, flanked by bailiffs. The atmosphere was tense, charged with emotion and anticipation. For weeks, the case had dominated headlines, sparking heated debates across the nation. Now everyone wanted to see how it would play out. The man sat quietly in the witness box, dressed simply but sharply. He wasn't there to seek revenge or bask in triumph. His presence was a statement, a reminder of why the system needed reform. As he took the stand, he glanced briefly at the officers. Their faces were pale, their eyes avoiding his gaze. They looked like shadows of the arrogant men who had once accused him of being a criminal. When the prosecutor asked him to recount what happened that night, he spoke clearly and calmly, painting a vivid picture of the events. "I was driving home," he began, his voice steady. "I hadn't broken any laws. I didn't know why they stopped me until they started making assumptions based on my race." He described every detail, the flashing lights, the guns drawn, the rough treatment during the arrest. He recounted how they ignored his attempts to identify himself, how they mocked him, and how they demanded $10,000 to let him go. His words carried weight, not just because of what he said, but because of who he was, a judge. Someone who understood the law inside and out, someone who represented fairness and integrity. Jurors leaned forward, hanging on every word. You could see it in their expressions. They were moved, angered even. This wasn't just another case. This was personal. It challenged everything they believed about justice. The defense team tried their best to poke holes in his testimony. They questioned his memory, suggested he might have misunderstood the situation, and argued that their clients had acted under stress. But none of it stuck. Every accusation crumbled under cross-examination. When one lawyer asked, "Are you sure you didn't provoke them somehow?" the entire courtroom fell silent. Even the judge presiding over the case raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "No," the man replied firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. "I did nothing wrong. And if you think otherwise, then we need to talk about why some people are presumed guilty before they've even opened their mouths." By the time he stepped down from the stand, the mood in the room had shifted. There was no doubt left in anyone's mind about what had happened, or who was responsible. The officers' lawyers scrambled to salvage their case, calling witnesses to testify on their behalf. But each account only dug them deeper into trouble. Former colleagues described patterns of misconduct, victims of past abuses came forward to share their stories, and internal records revealed ignored complaints and unchecked behavior. As closing arguments approached, the prosecution delivered a powerful speech. "This isn't just about one night," they told the jury. "It's about accountability. It's about recognizing the harm caused when those in power abuse it. These men aren't exceptions. They're symptoms of a larger problem. If we don't hold them accountable, we send a message that such actions are acceptable." The defense countered weakly, pleading for leniency and claiming their clients had learned their lesson. But their words rang hollow. Everyone in the courtroom knew the truth. These officers had shown no remorse until they realized they'd been caught. Their sudden apologies felt calculated, insincere, a desperate attempt to escape consequences. After hours of deliberation, the verdict came back, guilty on all charges. The moment the judge announced it, the gallery erupted in applause. People stood up, clapping and cheering, tears streaming down their faces. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, chanting slogans and holding signs. Social media lit up with messages of celebration and relief. Justice had been served, at least for now. For the officers, the ruling marked the beginning of a long fall from grace. Stripped of their badges, sentenced to prison, and publicly disgraced, they became symbols of everything wrong with unchecked authority. Their downfall sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies nationwide, forcing departments to re-evaluate training protocols and disciplinary measures. But for the man, the victory was bittersweet. Yes, he had exposed corruption and held these men accountable. Yes, he had inspired countless others to speak out against injustice. Yet he couldn't shake the memory of that night. The fear, the humiliation, the realization that his title hadn't shielded him from prejudice. It was a stark reminder that systemic racism wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. It required constant vigilance, effort, and courage. In the weeks following the trial, he threw himself into advocacy work. He partnered with civil rights organizations, pushing for reforms in policing practices. He advocated for mandatory body cameras, independent oversight boards, and stricter penalties for misconduct. He traveled the country, speaking at conferences and rallies, urging communities to demand better from their leaders. One evening, after addressing a large crowd, a young woman approached him. Her eyes glistened with tears as she thanked him for standing up. "I've been scared to report what happened to me," she confessed. "But hearing your story gives me hope." He smiled gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Don't thank me," he said. "Thank yourself for having the strength to believe change is possible. That's where real progress starts." And so the fight continued, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against injustice. The trial may have ended, but the movement it sparked was just beginning. The ripple effects of the trial spread far beyond the courtroom walls. It wasn't just about 4 officers being held accountable. It was a wake-up call for an entire city, maybe even the nation. People began to talk openly about issues they had long ignored or whispered about in private. Conversations around racial profiling, police misconduct, and systemic inequality moved from hushed tones at kitchen tables to front-page headlines and public forums. The man at the center of it all knew this was exactly what needed to happen. Justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoers. It was about sparking change that could last. In the weeks following the verdict, protests turned into organized movements. Community groups came together, demanding not just accountability, but real reform. They called for body cameras on every officer, stricter hiring standards, and independent oversight committees to investigate complaints against law enforcement. Local politicians, once hesitant to take a stand, found themselves under immense pressure to act. Some promised sweeping changes while others scrambled to save face. Either way, the momentum was undeniable. The man didn't stop there. He understood that exposing corruption was only half the battle. To truly make a difference, he needed to address the root causes of the problem. So he started small, meeting with community leaders, attending town halls and listening to stories from people who had faced similar injustices. Each story added fuel to his determination. There was the young father who had been stopped repeatedly for driving while black, the elderly woman whose home had been raided based on a faulty tip, and the teenager who had been roughed up by officers simply for standing on a street corner. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a much deeper issue. One evening, after a particularly emotional meeting with a group of activists, he decided to take things a step further. He founded an organization dedicated to fighting racial injustice and advocating for marginalized communities. The nonprofit focused on 3 key areas: education, advocacy, and support. They hosted workshops to teach people their rights during police encounters, provided free legal assistance to victims of misconduct, and pushed for policy changes at both local and national levels. Word of the organization spread quickly, drawing volunteers, donors, and supporters from all walks of life. Teachers donated classroom time to host seminars. Lawyers offered pro bono services. Artists created murals and music inspired by the cause. What started as a single man's mission became a collective effort, a movement fueled by hope and resilience. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. As the organization gained traction, so did opposition. Critics accused him of exaggerating the problem, claiming he was anti-police or trying to divide the community. Some even suggested he was using the incident for personal gain. At first, the accusation stung. After everything he'd been through, it hurt to hear people twist his intentions. But instead of letting negativity derail him, he used it as motivation to work harder. During one heated debate on a local news channel, a commentator challenged him directly. "Aren't you painting all officers with the same brush?" The commentator, asked smugly. Not every cop is corrupt. He nodded calmly, unfazed by the provocation. You're absolutely right, he replied. The vast majority of officers are good people doing tough jobs. But when bad apples go unchecked, it taints the entire barrel. We owe it to those honest officers, and to the communities they serve, to weed out corruption wherever we find it. His response still. Years had passed since that fateful night, but the man still remembered every detail as if it were yesterday. The cold metal of the handcuffs against his wrists, the mocking laughter of the officers, the weight of fear pressing down on him, it wasn't something you could easily forget. Yet as time went on, those memories began to transform. What once felt like a scar, a raw wound carved into his soul, started to become a source of strength. He carried it not as a burden, but as a reminder of why he kept fighting. By now, the organization he founded had grown into a national force for change. It wasn't just about addressing police misconduct anymore. It was about tackling systemic inequality in all its forms. Housing discrimination, unequal access to education, healthcare disparities, the list went on. Each issue was a thread in the same tangled web of injustice, and he was determined to unravel it one strand at a time. The work wasn't glamorous. There were no red carpets or standing ovations. Most days it meant sitting through long meetings with lawmakers who didn't want to listen. Other times, it meant standing outside in the rain, handing out flyers to people who barely glanced up from their phones. Progress was slow, frustratingly so. But every small victory, a new policy passed, a community empowered, a life changed, made it worth it. One afternoon, while going through old files in his office, he stumbled upon a letter tucked away in a dusty folder. It was from a young woman named Lisa, someone he had met years ago at one of the nonprofit's early events. At the time, she had been hesitant to share her story, her voice barely above a whisper. She told him how she had been stopped by police, late one night accused of theft, simply because she was walking home from work in a bad neighborhood. When she tried to explain herself, they dismissed her, laughing when she mentioned her job as a nurse. By the time they let her go, hours later, she was too shaken to even cry. Lisa wrote in the letter how hearing him speak that day gave her hope. I realized I wasn't alone, she said, and knowing that someone like you existed, someone who understood what it feels like to be treated unfairly, made me believe things could get better. Enclosed with the letter was a photo of Lisa in her nursing uniform, smiling brightly alongside her colleagues. She had gone on to advocate for patients' rights and mentor other women in her community. Reading her words, he felt a lump rise in his throat. This was what it was all about. Stories like Lisa's weren't rare. They poured in regularly, each one fueling his resolve. A father wrote to thank him for helping his son avoid jail time after a wrongful arrest. A teacher shared how the workshops had inspired her students to start a peer mentoring program focused on conflict resolution. Even former skeptics reached out, admitting they had underestimated the depth of the problem until they saw the data and heard the testimonies firsthand. But despite the progress, there were moments when doubt crept in. Change came slowly, painfully so. For every step forward, it often felt like 2 steps back. High-profile cases of police brutality continued to make headlines, reigniting protests and outrage. Politicians promised reforms during election cycles only to backtrack once votes were cast. And then there were the critics, the trolls online, the talking heads on TV, the naysayers who dismissed the movement as too radical or divisive. Late one night, after a particularly grueling week, he found himself staring out the window of his apartment. The city lights twinkled below, a sea of brightness that masked the struggles happening behind closed doors. He thought about everything he had sacrificed to get here. The sleepless nights, the strain on personal relationships, the toll it took on his health. Was it enough? Would it ever be enough? Just then, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from a friend who worked closely with the nonprofit. Check your email, the message read simply. Curious, he opened his inbox and found a video attachment. Clicking play, he saw footage from an event earlier that day. A group of high school students presenting their ideas for improving relations between youth and law enforcement. One boy stood up, microphone in hand, and spoke passionately about how the organization had inspired him to dream bigger. "Because of them," he said, pointing to the banner hanging behind him, "I know my voice matters." Tears welled up in his eyes as he watched. These kids, barely old enough to vote, were already thinking about solutions. They weren't waiting for permission or validation. They were taking action. In that moment, he realized something profound. The movement wasn't just about fixing broken systems. It was about planting seeds. Seeds of hope, resilience, and determination. Some would grow quickly, others might take decades. But as long as they kept planting, the forest would eventually flourish. With renewed energy, he threw himself back into the work. He traveled more, speaking at conferences and meeting with grassroots organizers across the country. He pushed for federal legislation to address racial profiling and increase transparency in policing. He collaborated with artists, filmmakers, and musicians to amplify the message through creative mediums. Everywhere he went, he reminded people that real change required collective effort. "It's not about one person leading the charge," he often said. "It's about all of us marching together." As the years rolled on, his legacy grew, not as a hero or savior, but as a catalyst. People saw him not as someone extraordinary, but as proof that ordinary individuals could spark extraordinary change. His story became a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of persistence and courage. And though he never sought recognition, awards and honors continued to come his way. Each time he accepted them graciously, using the platform to highlight the ongoing struggle and call for continued action. In interviews, reporters often asked him the same question. "After everything you've been through, do you feel hopeful about the future?" His answer was always the same. "Hope isn't something you wait for," he'd say. "It's something you create. Every time we stand up, speak out, or reach out to help someone else, we're building a better tomorrow." Looking back, he knew the journey hadn't been easy, and it likely never would be. The road to justice was long and winding, full of obstacles and setbacks, but it was also filled with moments of light, connection, and triumph. Those moments made every challenge worthwhile. Because in the end, it wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. And progress, no matter how slow, was worth fighting for. Years later, sitting in a quiet park on a crisp autumn afternoon, the man reflected on everything that had happened. The leaves crunched softly beneath his feet as he walked along the winding path, the golden sunlight filtering through the trees. It was peaceful here, a stark contrast to the chaos of protests, courtrooms, and late-night strategy sessions that had defined so much of his life. Yet, even in this calm setting, he couldn't escape the memories. That night, the flashing lights, the cold handcuffs, the mocking voices, still lingered in his mind. But over time, those painful recollections had transformed into something else, fuel for resilience. He thought about how far things had come since then. The nonprofit he founded wasn't just thriving, it was leading the charge for systemic change across the country. From grassroots initiatives to national policy reforms, its impact could be seen everywhere. Police departments implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. Independent oversight boards became standard practice in cities nationwide. Body cameras were no longer optional, they were required by law. These changes didn't happen overnight, but they happened because people refused to give up. What struck him most, though, was the ripple effect. It wasn't just policies or systems that changed, it was people. He remembered meeting a young boy at one of the organization's events years ago. The kid had been shy, barely speaking above a whisper when asked what he wanted to be when he grew up. "I don't know," he'd said, shrugging. "Maybe a cop or maybe not." Fast forward to today, and that same boy was now a college student studying criminal justice, determined to become an officer who did things differently. When he reached out recently to thank the man for inspiring him, It brought tears to his eyes. Stories like these reminded him why every sleepless night, every heated argument, every ounce of effort had been worth it. Change wasn't just happening in laws and institutions, it was happening in hearts and minds. But reflection also brought moments of vulnerability. There were times when he wondered if he'd done enough. Had he pushed too hard? Not hard enough? Could he have saved someone else from going through what he experienced? Doubts like these would creep in uninvited, especially during quiet moments like this. Still, he knew perfection wasn't the goal. Progress was messy, imperfect, and often frustratingly slow, but progress was still progress. One day, while attending a community event hosted by the nonprofit, he met an elderly woman who approached him with a warm smile. She introduced herself as someone who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. "You probably don't remember me," she said, her voice steady yet